Hey everyone, let's dive right into today's explainer, because we're looking at something absolutely fascinating. Today, we're examining a deeply intricate theory put forward by the Revealing Revelation channel, and their central premise is really captivating. What if the well-known differences between the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what if they aren't just varying perspectives of the same events? What if they actually hold a hidden, mathematically coded timeline for the end of days? It is a completely wild, totally different lens through which to view these ancient texts.
Now, for centuries, scholars have gone back and forth debating the variations in how the gospel writers recorded the same events, right? But instead of seeing these variations as contradictions or mistakes, the source of our explainer today views them as vital, intentional, prophetic clues. The theory basically argues that literally every single difference in the texts, especially when you look at their end times discourses, is there on purpose, mapping out a very specific, sequential timeline of eschatological events.
So here's our roadmap for our investigation today. First, we'll look at the hidden prophetic timeline. Second, the Gospel of Luke and the pre-tribulation escape. Third, Mark and Matthew's connection to the tribulation. Fourth, we'll dig into the textual clues. And finally, we'll compare being accounted versus counted worthy.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, a hidden prophetic timeline of 14 years and 50 days.
Okay, so if you follow eschatology at all, you're probably super familiar with the traditional belief of a 7-year tribulation period. But the channel's theory sharply contrasts with that whole idea. They draw on this really unique interpretation of the Apostle Paul's words in 2 Corinthians 12, where Paul mentions knowing a man caught up above 14 years ago. Based on this, the source theorizes that the end times actually span a full 14 years, preceded by a 50-day portion they refer to as the above. And here is where it gets really interesting. The source takes this precise chronological journey and maps it directly onto the 3 synoptic gospels. The first 50 days? Those align with Luke's discourse, representing a pre-tribulation escape. Then, boom, we enter the 14 years. The first 7 years are the seals tribulation, represented by Mark's discourse, and the final 7 years are the trumpets tribulation, which maps to Matthew's discourse. So, as the source points out, the first will be last and the last will be first, because reading the prophetic timeline chronologically actually means jumping from Luke to Mark and finally to Matthew.
Moving right along to Section 2, Luke and the pre-tribulation escape.
This comparison perfectly illustrates the source's data-driven approach. When you look up the Greek words for persecution and tribulation, they show up heavily in Mark and Matthew, 5 times each in these contexts, to be exact. But in the Gospel of Luke, absolutely zero, nothing. The source argues there's no way this is a coincidence. It's highly intentional. It suggests that Luke's end times narrative specifically represents a pre-tribulation bride of Christ. It's a group that literally just isn't present for the suffering that's about to hit. And this whole idea is anchored by Luke 21:36. The source emphasizes that only in Luke's discourse do we find an actual pre-tribulation event taking place in a single verse. The people mentioned here are promised an escape. They are promised to avoid the tribulation entirely and to stand before the Son of Man with zero condemnation. It is this incredibly protective, exclusive promise for those who are accounted worthy.
Which brings us to Section 3, Mark and Matthew, the tribulation.
Now, the source breaks down these 2 distinct 7-year periods and points out something fascinating about their intended prophetic audiences. Mark's gospel, representing the first 7 years of seals, is theorized to be addressing the sleeping church world, those who weren't filled with the Spirit, people who were caught up in worldly things, and were entirely unready for that initial pre-tribulation escape we just talked about. Matthew, on the other hand, represents the second 7 years of trumpets, and its prophetic messaging is directed very specifically to the Jews.
To prove this massive shift from Luke's condemnation-free escape to this harsh period of spiritual reckoning, the explainer points to parallel stories in the Gospels. Take the story of the woman married 7 times. In Luke's version, Jesus calls believers the children of God. Nice, right? But in both Mark 12 and Matthew 22, Jesus explicitly tells the audience, "You do err, not knowing the Scriptures." Ouch. The themes of error, unreadiness, and condemnation enter the picture precisely when the text moves into the prophetic tribulation timeline.
Okay, let's jump into Section 4, Textual Clues Hidden in Plain Sight.
This is honestly my favorite part. It's like a giant textual puzzle. Think about the robe placed on Christ before the cross. In Luke 23, the robe is described with a Greek word that means gorgeous, radiant, or white, which totally ties into that bridal purity and the pre-tribulation escape idea.
But over in Mark 15, the robe is purple, and in Matthew 27, it's scarlet. The source directly connects Mark and Matthew's colors, purple and scarlet, to the infamous woman riding the beast in Revelation 17, symbolizing intense persecution and tribulation. Mind-blowing, right?
Similarly, mapping out the really subtle differences in how the clouds are described builds this incredibly compelling visual argument for a chronological timeline. In Luke 21, the Son of Man comes in a singular cloud, just one. The source maps this to the 8th day of the 50-day escape. In Mark, he comes in the clouds, plural, aligning with the end of the first 6 years of the seals. And then in Matthew, the phrasing changes yet again. It says coming on the clouds of heaven at the very end of the 13 years.
Actually, the source drills down even deeper into the original Greek to clarify that last point in Matthew. While our English translations usually say in the clouds, the specific Greek word used, it's number 1909 in the Strong's Concordance, actually translates to on. The source argues this specific preposition denotes a physical return. We're talking feet completely down on the Mount of Olives, marking the final phase. Explaining this tiny nuance really demonstrates the sheer depth of textual analysis driving this whole theory.
Finally, let's wrap things up with Section 5, accounted versus counted worthy. This is a crucial distinction. Remember that phrase from Luke 21 we looked at earlier, accounted worthy? Well, the source highlights that this specific Greek phrasing, which indicates those who escape and obtain the world as children of God without any condemnation, that phrase is exclusively found in the Gospel of Luke. This is the primary group that completely, 100% bypasses the 14 years of tribulation.
But hold on, because there is a stark contrast we need to talk about. While Luke talks about being accounted worthy to escape, books like Acts and 2 Thessalonians speak of believers being counted worthy of. And what exactly are they counted worthy of? To suffer shame and endure tribulation for the Lord's name. I mean, this is a totally different experience from the complete escape described in Luke. So that raises the obvious question, who on earth is this suffering group?
Well, according to the explainer, this group is a very special remnant. They are actually chosen from among the accounted worthy believers, but they willingly choose to remain behind. They literally put their necks on the line to serve the Lord during that intense 14-year tribulation period, enduring incredible, unthinkable hardship to help bring in His people. And because they suffer with Him, the theory concludes that they ultimately take part in the first resurrection and are glorified together to rule and reign with Christ.
So, what do you think? It's an incredibly detailed and intricate framework, right? Could these tiny, seemingly minor textual variations, the color of a robe, a singular versus plural cloud, or the presence of a single Greek preposition, could they truly be the key to unlocking a hidden 14-year prophetic timeline? Whether you view these differences as just natural variations in storytelling or as a precise, mathematically coded roadmap, this analysis for sure makes you want to open up those ancient texts and look at the Synoptic Gospels with a completely fresh set of eyes. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and always look closely at the details. Catch you next time.